So welcome to Deep Down Innate Wisdom and Person-Centered Therapy. The reason I've given it that title is because, in a sense, I think they're all bound together. Certainly in Person-Centered Therapy, the principles that underlie the phrase deep down, in terms of our sort of innate capacity for knowing, and it's also in terms of what we mean when we say deep down. We're not just talking about, because it's synonymous with saying in truth or in reality. So that's a large fundamental aspect of what we mean when we say deep down. But the other aspect of it, of course, is that we're talking about within us, a place within us. It's a knowledge that's coming from us. So there is a capacity in us that's like innately wise. It's not overt. It's implicit and possibly underneath the surface, but at the same time, it seems to be a kind of fundamental human experience and something that we all tend to agree with, even if we may have quite a kind of empirical, let's say, positivist perspective on the world. Most people would nod along if you said, well, deep down, they know, or deep down, I knew it deep down really, etc. So there is that kind of shared experience that I'd say 99% of us probably would agree with. So there's almost a paradoxical aspect to it as well, because as well as it being something that seems to be accessible to us all, there's also this sense that it's coming from the dark almost, from somewhere that's not, because it's not overt, there is this sense of it being drawn out from a place that's almost buried. And it's kind of, there's a reflection of the sort of statements that Lao Tzu said about truth, in that, the true statements seem paradoxical. So it's a paradox in the sense that it seems to be a shared universal thing, but at the same time, it's something that also seems obscure in a way. It's there and ever present, but it's also obscure, which is often the case with what we could call perennial truths. The kind of words of truth are paradoxical, as well as it being a Taoist sort of idea, let's say, or certainly a Taoist verse in the book of the Tao Te Ching. We've also got there's other systems that will reflect this kind of concept, that there is a kind of innate intrinsic wisdom or an innate intrinsic knowing. So there's jnana in Sanskrit, which is usually referred to in Buddhism, and that's kind of like primordial wisdom, really. A wisdom that always applies, a wisdom that's always been there. It's primordial because it's always been there. It's not something that's constructed. It's not something that's been taught. When we're talking about intuition, we tend to, when we use that word, we tend to be talking about something that's coming from our core, which again is an interesting term in itself. It's not something that's been cultivated in some way. You could argue that the access to it may be a cultivation. The uncovering of it may be a process of kind of removing obscurations in order to gain access to it. But the actual source of that wisdom is seen as being innate and primordial. And then there's also sort of the Greek term gnosis. So Gnosis is innate wisdom again, or at least the innate wisdom of understanding the sort of divine nature of phenomena, divine nature of the way things are and the way the world is. And then even if we go back as far as sort of the ancient Egyptian pantheon, then we've got, a god like Thoth. So Thoth was the god of wisdom, and had sort of a very potent symbolic message in terms of where he came from, because Thoth didn't have parents. He didn't emerge from causes in that sense. He was like self-arisen. So Thoth, having a self-arisen nature, is representing a reflection of our own ability to know certain truths about our life, about the knowledge within us. The knowledge comes from within us. And ultimately, we don't need parents, teachers, counselors for us to know or have self-knowledge. Of course, the caveat in that is that it's not to invalidate those figures in our life in terms of them being facilitators, but our innate qualities that are needed are not, from this perspective that I'm talking of at least, they're not something that's kind of taken on. They're maybe awoken or uncovered or helped to be, the obscurations to those are assisted by those types of figures, but they're only facilitatory. Our knowledge, our wisdom is sort of self-arisen. And I mean, if I reflect on my own experience, so, I've got a Sri Lankan background, and, I was a Buddhist monk for, a number of years at least. There is a core principle in Buddhism, which goes back to something called the Tathagata Garbha, which is the Buddha nature, really. Buddha nature is the true nature of all beings. So it's not simply, depends on which perspective and which sect of Buddhism you're looking at, but certainly from the point of view of Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhism, we're not looking at something that needs to be kind of cultivated in some way. It's there already from beginningless time. The true nature of all beings is the Buddha nature, fully awakened. Now, that can be symbolized by a very common motif that's in Buddhism, which is the lotus. And you may have heard of the mantra that's often translated as "Hail to the jewel in the lotus." So Om Mani Padme Hum, or Om Mani Padme Hum, or Om Mani Padme Hum, depending on whether we're talking about Tibetan or Sanskrit translations. So the jewel is within the lotus, so the jewel being your Buddha nature, and the jewel being within the lotus, and it's never affected ultimately by external conditions. The external conditions in the metaphor being a swampy kind of mess that you would think could sort of taint or sully a flower that's trying to emerge and grow in that kind of, in those surroundings. Yet when it does open, if you've ever seen a lotus or a water lily, like emerging out of a muddy water, when it does fully open, it is completely immaculate in that sense, and it doesn't seem to have been affected at all by that kind of muddy environment. So of course that's a strong metaphor to suggest that we have that within us, that's our true nature, and that whatever we go through, whatever seemingly traumatic, twisted, broken environment we may come from, ultimately, when we emerge and realize our true nature, there is no, it's untainted. It's not actually been affected. And this is related to deep down, in the sense of the place in which our wisdom is emanating from is from our Buddha nature. So from that perspective, from the Buddha Dharma perspective, that's very much jnana is a facet, is an aspect of our Buddha nature. So if we're looking more at person-centered theory, so the reason I bring up person-centered theory is partly because it underpins most modalities of psychotherapy, with maybe a few exceptions, but almost every modality you encounter, it will have this idea of the client having their own agency and their own intrinsic wisdom. Because without that, person-centered theory can't function. Because ultimately what we're doing is we're simply facilitating the client being able to understand their own being and their own processes, and that they have the minerals, so to speak, to be able to find a more, let's say, optimal way of being. And that's really, in terms of how that unfolds, their optimal way of being is by understanding themselves. And by having a fuller understanding of themselves, then the optimal way of being naturally occurs, naturally emerges out of that experience. So, Carl Rogers, the founder of person-centered therapy, or what was called client-centered therapy at one time, he had a deep appreciation of Eastern philosophy, and certainly, he quotes Taoism and the Tao Te Ching a few times in some of his books. In The Way of Being, he refers to, having respect for the natural play of things and not imposing one's own will upon the world. And of course, that can also be applied to not imposing one's own will on one's client. So, not directing the client in a kind of forceful way, not laying one's own frame of reference upon the client. So if we're looking at what's the relevance of sort of philosophical developments and counselling, why would philosophy, be connected with counselling and therapy? Well, in terms of personality theory, and personality theories that are fundamentally linked to value judgments, they can't not be. We can't have a system of therapy and counselling without some kind of value judgment. Where are we going with this? What are we aiming at with clients? There has to be some defined value or standard in terms of a trajectory. Whether that's established by us or the client is in question, but there needs to be something. So a primary consideration in any personality theory is, how should one live? What is it to be a healthy individual? If we're talking about mental health, there has to be some standards or concepts of what are the aims, what are the goals of that. And with the natural sciences, we don't have any axioms to base a theory upon in terms of how to live, which is, why there is philosophy, and why there is we'll never remove the phenomenon of philosophy, It's arguable in itself, the need for philosophy, but in order to argue the need for philosophy, you need to use philosophy. There's always going to be philosophy involved, so there's no way around it. So understanding a theory's philosophical background where helps us to orientate our perspective, to understand the theory in a deeper way. So as a counsellor, one needs to continually examine one's own motivations, one's impulses and feelings. I mean, Rogers stated that a therapist's philosophy, especially one's, the individual and their professional work, in that relationship can't be ignored. You need to ask yourself, whether you truly view the individual as having their own intrinsic worth, their own dignity and their own right. Is there respect present for every individual's right to self-direction? How comfortable are we to accept that an individual's inherent right to identify and select their own values without imposing our own frame of reference? Can we do that? And if a counsellor's not aligned with that position, with a philosophy that's, very much kind of in harmony with a person-centered perspective, then there is a genuine risk that they might just be paying lip service to what the person-centered theory is to some degree. But then when it comes to actually applying their service or their practice with clients, that, are they able to let that client draw on their own inherent resources for their own self-development? Or are they thinking, well, I kind of know better, and then interjecting with their own values, their own direction upon the client, and essentially they're kind of like devaluing them as a capable human being with their own agency. So it's essential, really, that counsellors and therapists question that as an ongoing thing as well. It's not simply that you sit down one day, do it before you start practicing, and then never think about it again. You have to keep questioning yourself about whether you're entering into that relationship and that interaction with some sense of being impeccable to a degree. Even if that's impossible, that should be our trajectory, that should be our aim. That's how we're extending ourselves towards that. Do we really believe in a person-centered philosophy, or are we operating from a value system that's we say certain things because that's what counsellors should say, but what's underpinning the actual conduct? Where are we going? What's driving our conduct with our client? So a person-centered, or the person-centered axiom, that the individual is naturally and essentially directed from within, or it should be during the counselling process, is like a fundamental motivation that drives one forward to self-actualization. We're talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, really, that typifies the sort of phenomenological approach. And that's prioritizing the individual's experience as the director of action. And the emphasis upon the client as the expert on their own mind, regardless of what qualifications the therapist or counsellor might have. The client should be regarded as the expert on their own mind. They have that phenomenological experience that we don't have in regard to their subjective experience. And if we're talking about phenomenology, then that's what the philosophy is about. It's about primarily emphasizing subjective experience and that an objective experience in terms of a human perspective is impossible to establish anyway. Experientially, we cannot establish an objective experience. We can only ever relate our subjective experience. So the individual alone is qualified to understand their own personal dimension of their experience. So regardless of, what I've said above, so to speak, the modality of counselling that embraces person-centered theory does have a sort of profound connection with the principles underlying the phrase deep down. And it seems that despite us being an ostensibly secular society or as a secular culture, that there is a conviction and a large kind of unanimous agreement that we do have this ability to, understand from within. And I'd say that you probably agree and that you know it deep down.